Hi there. I've previously reviewed other books by David Hepworth, who specialises in writing about popular music, and the book I want to talk about today, Uncommon People, is really his ode to the rock star, and he kind of puts the rock stars in a bracket from 1955 to 1994, and the format of the book is he has a chapter dedicated to each era between those dates and one of the most significant stars. The first rock star in the book is the one I want to concentrate on in this review, and I will only very briefly mention any of the others. I just want to concentrate on the tale of Richard Penniman, otherwise known as Little Richard. Quoting from the book, according to Richard, who began burnishing his legend from an early age, he was born deformed. One eye was clearly bigger than the other. One leg was certainly shorter than the other. Hence, Richard walked with short steps, which gave him a mincing gait. In the Pleasant Hill section of Macon, Georgia, during the Second World War, at a time when sympathy for differences was in short supply, he came in for rough treatment. They called him faggot, sissy, punk and freak, and those were his friends. So from an early age he began performing in bars and clubs around Macon, Georgia, and you can imagine the prejudice that he experienced, being both homosexual and black in the early 1950s in the deep south of America. However, there was a subculture in which he flourished, and he became one of the retinue of an act fronted by a flamboyant character called Sugarfoot Sam from Alabama, who makes Graham Norton look like Razor Ruddock, apparently. And Little Richard took influences from many people, including Sam, and developed his unique style, or his own idiosyncratic style, which included a very highly piled pompadour hairstyle, very well dressed, flamboyant dancing, flamboyant playing of the piano, and a high falsetto singing. It came for a time for him to make a record, and they went into the studio, and it wasn't really going particularly well. He wasn't setting anything on fire, and they had a break and went over to a bar for refreshments, and there was a piano in there, and it was a rather disreputable bar, to say the least. Richard jumped on the piano and started belting out a song he was making up with very scatological lyrics, but it got the place on fire and everybody was jumping and clapping and so on. And the producer said, well, why don't we record that, but we'll have to change the lyrics. So they went back to the studio and they got one of the ladies who worked there to not a young lady, a middle-aged lady, to write a more sedate version of the lyrics, which, not to put too fine a point on it, were very, very sexual. And she changed them, and this became Tutti Frutti, massive hit. Now at that time the music industry was divided on racial lines, and so they wanted a white artist to cover this hit, and they chose Pat Boone. Now this would be like getting Val Doonigan to record one of the Sex Pistols records, and I think even Pat Boone admitted later on that he was embarrassed by it. But it caused the records caused Richard great success, and he toured widely, including into the UK. And I'll put a link to a live performance he gave in the Granada TV studio in, I think, 1964, backed by Sounds Incorporated, who were a very good band at the time. And you'll see the energy of Little Richard. It was just absolutely amazing. And he was very influential. And one of the people he was influential toward was John Lennon. And there's a story where John Lennon, who was a massive Elvis fan when he was putting together the Quarrymen and playing skiffle, and to John there was no one to beat Elvis. But one of his friends, a chap called Michael Hill, had gone over to Holland and picked up the LP of Little Richard, and he said to John Lennon, he said, "I've got this record inspired guy who's every bit as good as Elvis." And this kind of affronted John, who regarded himself as the arbiter of what was good and cool and so on. And so that him and a few other guys went round to Michael Hill's place, and he put this record on, and it was Long Tall Sally. And John had to admit he was entranced. And he actually is quoted as saying, "How the record presented first a challenge, then a wedge that opened his mind to unconsidered possibilities. When I heard Long Tall Sally, it was so great I couldn't speak. You know how you're torn? I didn't want to leave Elvis. Elvis was bigger than religion in my life. We all looked at each other, but I didn't want to say anything against Elvis, not even in my mind. How could they be happening in my life, both of them?" That was from Mark Lewison's book on the Beatles, but it illustrates the influence that Little Richard had on the Beatles. And when the Quarrymen morphed into the Beatles, they included quite a few Little Richard numbers in the repertoire. And when they came back from Hamburg and played the Litherland Town Hall on the 27th of December 1960, they opened with Long Tall Sally. The curtains opened and Paul belted out Long Tall Sally, and the rest is history. They immediately became the top band in Liverpool at the time, and very, very quickly were earning 3 times the money of any of the other bands. So you know, the repertoire they'd built up in Hamburg, including the Little Richard songs, was very, very significant. And Paul, his version of Long Tall Sally is absolutely superb. He brings his own interpretation to it. The Beatles belted out, the instruments are great, the harmonies are great, but Paul's voice, absolutely well suited to the song. I had a meal in Macon, Georgia, a couple of years ago, or a few years ago, when we were in Georgia on a training gig. And sitting there, I soaked in the atmosphere and I reflected, this is where Little Richard started. And I did get to see him. I had seen him previous to that. He was appearing in 2005 at the Olympia, and I was working at another part of the complex that the Olympia was part of, and we used to use the Olympia as a shortcut. And I went in, and Little Richard was on stage, and unfortunately there was only a handful of people in the audience watching this absolute legend, and I was able to stay long enough to hear 3 numbers, all top hits, things like Long Tall Sally and A Whole Lot of Shaking. His voice was amazing, his piano playing was still there. He wasn't mobile, he couldn't dance and fling himself around, but he made up for it with his voice. What an absolute rock star. Another rock star chapter covers an early British guitar hero, Hank B. Marvin. And the story of Hank, whose real name is Brian Rankin, was him and his good friend, school friend, Bruce Welch, were very keen guitarists in the skiffle era up in Newcastle. And they decided to hitchhike to London and try their fortunes on the London scene. The Two Eyes Coffee Bar had become known as the birthplace of British rock and roll, and Tommy Steele and so on, Adam Faith, people like that were discovered there. And so the boys decided to go down to London and with their cheap guitars, making some money doing odd gigs here, there and everywhere, but also working as glass collectors and whatever they could do. A lady took them in. She ran a boarding house and gave them a room, didn't charge them much rent, so they did have a roof over their heads. And eventually they were discovered. A guy came in and he was looking for Tony Sheridan. Tony Sheridan never had any luck. He wasn't there that night, but Hank got up on stage, and the guy approached him, and he was the manager for Cliff Richard, and he offered Hank the job. And Hank said, well, I'll take it if my mate can join as well, which was Bruce. And the two of them joined what was then the Drifters, which became the Shadows. Tony Sheridan eventually went off to Hamburg and was kind of a mentor to the Beatles, but they made it and he stayed in obscurity. So the interesting thing was that these two Geordie guys, unlike the Beatles, who came down from Liverpool and really didn't make any concessions to the London scene and the London recording industry, Hank and Bruce did. They changed their accents. They started talking with this kind of accentless kind of radio type voice, and started playing. Now at first they were very much into the same type of music as John Lennon and Paul McCartney were listening to in Liverpool. They were into the music of Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, people like that, and Little Richard. And they had a repertoire playing that. But then once they got into the recording studio with Norrie Paramore, they were kind of homogenized, and they started playing instrumentals, things like Apache, #1 hit. But backing Cliff as the Shadows, he was persuaded to go into more middle of the road type music, which was unfortunate because he had made the best British rock and roll record of the time, Move It. Absolutely, it still stands the test of time. But that's what the music industry insisted upon. It was only later that the Beatles were able to kick against that. So that was the story of Hank. Many other personalities in the book, people from Bob Dylan to David Bowie, Jerry Lee Lewis and his story when he came over here with his underage wife and so on. Absolutely fascinating stories, all told with the very apt pen of David Hepworth, one of our best writers on the music scene, and it's certainly a book that I've enjoyed greatly.